And what issues were you understanding at that particular time that you were looking at to review?
As I read the complaint, it appeared that she felt that her items that she had consigned may have been sold for more than she received, and some of the payments that had not been received in a timely fashion, as well as some of her items appeared to have been mishandled and broken.
And
in a state auction services response to the board subpoena, there was a narrative concerning some of the items. I guess let's stick with the arm lock, which I think is one of the biggest questions, which is one of the things that Ms. Vasilla eventually got paid for, but not in what she considered or what I believe the law considered in a timely fashion. In the response, the state auction services indicated that when they lose a tag or in some way don't know who the consignor is, they strike it off to a 9,000 series lot number. And that was how the confusion occurred with Ms. Vasilla's arm lock, in that they ended up paying another consignor under the assumption that it was his sold item. They eventually got with that consignor, I do not know who that is, retrieved the money and eventually paid Ms. Vasilla. Was sold 9/16/2012, I believe, if a handwritten annotation here is correct.
Excuse me, it's not Oak.
But you can't talk in this proceeding.
They're talking about a different one.
Well, to be specific, item number 9009 listed as arm lock sold to bidder number 41 for $625, according to the records of the auction company on 9/16/2012.
And the actual payment to Ms. Vasilla was on what date?
That was November 7th, I believe it was. Yeah, November 7th, 2012.
There were actually two armoires that were involved, but the one that we talked about was given the 9,000 series was the one that was some confusion as to the ownership of that particular item, correct?
Yes.
Now, as a result of your investigation, were you asked to do anything else in connection with this matter?
Yes.
Mr. Benston, Jacobs here with a question. I have a question, Mr. Steele, is that correct? Do your records reflect when the auctioneer actually received payment for the merchandise? Was it on the date that it was sold, which was 9/16/2012, or was it after that date? And if so, what date?
And I don't know when they actually received payment for that item.
Okay, so you have no records that would show that?
No, ma'am.
All right, thank you.
What additional items were, instructions were you given?
There were a number of bidders, buyers, that received these various items that may have been in question either because they were of similar description, say an arm lock, or they were a 9,000 series number consigned by Ms. Vasilla. Now, before I say I go any further, let me say that all of the interviews that I conducted with these bidders were over the phone. I did not actually physically look at these items, nor did I have any photographs or depictions or descriptions other than what I've been given here.
Now, are there any restrictions on Mr. Ken Buhler that you are aware of as it relates to his activities as an auctioneer?
There's a number of them. The only one that I guess, that I can state before the board under oath that I know for sure is that he's not allowed to handle contracts or negotiate contracts.
And there was actually an agreement regarding his reinstatement as a license. Were you involved with any of that investigation previously?
I was, but I must tell you that was quite some time ago, so without an actual, if you were to show me the document, I can tell you what those are, but I don't recall them off the top of my head. But that certainly does make sense.
Okay. There's, I understand that Ms. Fasolo did not sign the consignment document, and that was your test of contract, is that correct?
She signed a document, I believe she has a document that she signed.
But did she actually sign the consignment contract
Not
that
the
you
one-
reviewed?
Not any of the ones that I reviewed.
So it only had the auctioneer's signature on it, is that correct?
Mac Buhler.
And did you find out why it was devoid of the seller's signature?
From my interview with Ms. Fasola, and perhaps she would be better to ask this question, but from my interview, she signed a document in a, I guess, in a kind of trust, you know, assuming that.
Now, I'm going to ask her some questions. It's important for me to make this decision.
Yeah, she signed a document.
Okay.
But not the document.
Okay,
that
not
I
the
signed.
document. Did she review the,
I sold my furniture, I'm sorry, he sold my furniture, he says at one price. And I told him, I can't let my things go at such a cheap cost to send my things back. He kept putting me off, and when he did finally bring, he didn't have all I told him, especially the primitive and the library table and the birthing chair 2 months ago. He, after 2 months, says, oh, I sold it. He was loud, scary at the time, and I asked him to not let my neighbors hear him. He said he hoped he never saw my face again. His child and worker said I could have reserved, put on my furniture. He said I got on him telling his children and the man. I got on to them for telling you that. The man is a shyster. This is my personal.
that's usually reserved for lawyers, by the way,
Okay, calling to
of
make.
which I'm one.
I know, calling to make sure he couldn't sell anything else, but he still sold them. His father knows also. And they broke the bond with the wind lamp. The library table fell apart when they delivered it apart, and it was in great shape when he took it. I gave Ken the chance to improve his reputation, but he still is the same old Ken. I never raised my voice to him, but had to endure his yelling and disrespect. I am hurt and disgusted.
Is yes, I signed this.
Yes, I did.
And who was the person, was it signed when you
I
received it
can't-
from Mr. Buhler or Ken Buhler, or do you recall?
What does it say in the bottom there? It says Mac Buhler, but it was given to me by the nephew.
Was his signature on it when you signed
I
it?
didn't,
So when the items were picked up from your house, were you given a list of items that were picked up from your house?
no.
So this was signed in blank with no indication of.
And I reluctantly did it. I'm like, wait a minute, look, y'all taking all my furniture.
They come and pick up your items. Did you ask either Mr. Buhler to put a reserve on any particular item?
As I stated in my complaint, that his own son said, Ms. Judy, why don't you go ahead and put the reserve on it? I said, I can do that? And he said, oh, yes, ma'am. I got in the phone, called Ken, no answer. I eventually got in touch with him, and I said, Ken, I'd like to, I can't let my things go like this. I need to put a reserve on. He said, yeah, I got all over their ass for telling you that. I can't do reserves. I couldn't make any money if I did reserves.
And this is your
And I said,
speaking.
well, you need to get my things back.
So when,
We had talked, and I said, I just can't, I just can't. And so right then, I said, he said, do you want me to bring your stuff back? I said, you're going to have to, Ken. I just can't afford to let my things go.
Okay, Mr. Banks, excuse me, because it's a little bit confusing. This is Jacobs here. did she have that conversation with him before or after the items were sold? Because I understand the whole auction, the entire auction took place on 9/16. So at any time before 9/16, did she tell him, no, I don't want to sell it for that price?
He would not let me he would not sit down with me and say, okay, what would you like for this or that? And I
So
was-
the auction had
I
already
kept
taken
waiting for
place
that.
though, huh?
Yeah, I was like.
So the auction, you told him about your dissatisfaction after the auction had taken
Right,
place.
when he came to
That's
my
what I need to know.
home, I thought there would be a time when we would sit down, go over my things. I have a total of 26 items. And there were only like 10 or 11 items that were sold at that auction.
So there was a lack of communication between you and him?
I couldn't, never get into contact. I couldn't.
So does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
You had some additional issues that you raised in your complaint where you initially thought that some of the items did not go for the amount that you got paid for. Is that correct?
I had a personal sit-down conversation on his actual, we had been talking, Mr. Steele and I said, honestly, I just don't think he sold my things at that, but that's my personal opinion. I can't prove anything. I really told him I cannot let my things go at that price. And then
Did you complain about something other than what we've already
No,
talked about
no.
in your complaint?
I just read my complaint.
Okay, so
Now,
the answer to
Mr.
the question is no, or is it yes?
Mr. Steele is the one that said, having a private conversation between he.
Excuse me, Madam Chairman, I mean, I think we ought to stick to what the complaint, this particular
Exactly.
complaint. That's the only thing that's
Exactly.
before the board, not something that may have been
Exactly.
discussed.
Hearsay.
I'm going to ask that any extraneous information regarding what someone may have thought or what took place outside the complaint not come into this
Well,
tribunal.
if there's an investigation and it leads to additional charges, the board can bring those charges, and they've chosen to do so in this case.
They shouldn't be discussed at this meeting because it's not part of the complaint for this particular meeting.
I don't think she's discussing anything
Well,
outside of her complaint, yes, but not outside of the complaint
I think
letter.
she answered it, that's the complaint, she read the complaint, that is what we're adjudicating here.
But you indicated just a second ago that you called another auction house because you have to get your stuff sold. Which auction house is that?
randomly chose Acord, a Tommy Acord.
Ask you if you would. The document that I believe is marked as number 5 that you signed, right above that, is there language that tells you, or explains that it will be, your property will be sold to the highest bidder?
Yes, it says that.
I don't have any other questions.
Okay, any
I do have
redirect?
some questions.
Just a second, any redirect? All right, go ahead, Ms. Jacobs.
I just have some questions. Mr. Solo, I'm an auctioneer from the New Orleans area. How are you today?
Fine, thank
All
you.
right, thank you for coming. We're all very interested in investigating complaints. However, let me point out to you that when an auctioneer sells movable merchandise, they do it based upon the current market, what the current market will bear, and not what the item is worth, unless, of course, you get an appraisal and there's a reserve placed on the piece that you want to sell. So keeping that in mind, I have some questions for you. Was there any document that you signed that put a reserve on any of the merchandise that was supposed to be sold by the auctioneer?
That's when I called and said, stop.
I'm talking about when you initially gave it to him, with that document
I
that you
was
didn't
waiting-
sign when it was listed.
Yeah, I was waiting for him to come over, sit down, let's go over and see what we're gonna, I never saw him again.
So is it correct, though, that when you actually gave him the portfolio of the merchandise that was going to be sold, which, by the way, is his signature but not your signature, there was no reserve placed on any item? Is that correct? Because I didn't see it on the document.
Well, I don't know anything about auctions, I have no idea.
So your answer would be no to that question?
Right,
All right. And even
I
though,
was assuming he was coming back to.
okay, so you
sit
thought he would
down.
come back?
Yeah.
Okay, did he tell you, when you gave him all this merchandise, did you all discuss a date when the sale was gonna go through? Did he tell you it was gonna be on 9/16?
I told him I only wanted it to go when he had better things. And that's when I was waiting for him to come back and sit down and go, like, I need to get this for this, I need to get this. I never saw him again.
And- Okay,
But he has smaller auctions, he told me, on Fridays. And I said, I don't want my things in the, I want it in the better auctions.
I understand.
I don't understand what he was talking about, but
So the question was, did you know that it was your property was gonna be auctioned on
On
9/16?
9/16.
Yes or
I
no?
don't remember if I knew that it was that date,
All right.
but
Okay.
I'm probably,
Okay.
around that time.
Okay, and even though you didn't sign the consignment contract, did you review it when it was written? Did you look at it to make sure that all of your merchandise was on that consignment
It
contract?
was empty, that's my contract right there.
So you never did review it?
I never saw that contract.
Or were you given a copy of it by the auctioneer?
Never.
Okay.
No. His
And-
nephew gave me that on the way out and said, you gotta sign here so they'll know that I said, but it's empty. Oh, well, that's all right, you just, and I'm like, okay, I mean, Wyatt, his son was there, I had a witness, so I said, okay, I'll sign it, but there's nothing on it.
Were you present at the auction when the auction took place?
For about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and when I went there.
That's all, you answered the question.
And so you were present when the auction took place?
Just briefly.
Now, the auction took place according to the information we have on 9/16/2012, and you received money according to your testimony on 9/24 for everything but the armoire, is that correct?
Yes.
So you
Not
actually-
everything, no ma'am, only a few items
Okay.
that were sold.
So actually, of the items that were sold, you received your money according to your testimony within 8 days after the auction, is that correct?
From 9/16 to 10, from 8/16,
Well, it was 9/16 was the auction, and I believe you testified that on 9/24 you received.
that's when the check,
Now,
wait ma'am, that's when the check was dated. I don't know, I think it was probably after that, but that's okay.
well, did you
I
try
got
to
the check.
cash it on 9/24 and somebody tell you, oh, the funds are not available?
No,
All right. So you kept the check, in fact, you still haven't cashed any of these checks.
no, that first check, when I saw what I was getting for things, I said, we have to stop.
Okay. So you never cashed it.
And on that.
Yes or no?
Yes, I cashed the first check, yes.
Did you cash it right after you got it, if you got it on 9/24?
I didn't, what I'm saying is, I don't know if I got it on 9/24, it was dated 9/24.
Did you cash it 2 days after you got it?
Immediately, I went to the bank.
All right, so-
Okay, but I'm
Okay.
saying the armoire was not on that.
I
check.
understand. We
Just
understand
answer
that.
the question.
Now, did you call to see why your check on the armoire was delayed? Did you ever place a telephone call to the auctioneer?
Why should I? It wasn't on the list.
So no.
So the answer to that is no.
No.
And is it correct that you didn't deal with Ken Buhler, you dealt with Matt Buhler?
I never met Mac before in my life.
So you did, okay, so you never met Matt, so you dealt with Ken?
Right,
And only with Ken?
right.
That's all the questions I have.
You recognize this particular document?
Yes, I do.
And could you tell me what that document is?
This is an agreement that I drew up on behalf of the board for Mr. Buhler to agree to. This is in the form of one of our stipulations that we do, a consent stipulation on a complaint. And I presented that to Mr. Buhler, and I think to his attorney in 2010, as far as his ability to come back and auction again, get an auctioneer's license.
There were certain restrictions that were imposed upon him for returning to being able to have a license.
That's correct.
And could you go over those restrictions that he may have?
Certainly. Specifically, the restrictions on practice were that he could not execute any agreements with sellers, consignors, or with buyers. And he could not receive any money from buyers or pay any consignors. In other words, he could not handle any money for any auction. He, at that time, had agreed to work under Estate Auction Services or Henderson Auctions, and he would only call auctions. If he had another auction that was not Estate Auction Services or Henderson Auctions, he had to notify the board in writing of the auction at least 30 days prior to the auction. Unless there was some reason he just got hired within that period, he had to notify the board immediately. He also had to continue to pay on a sales tax judgment, which we provided a copy of it to him, an amount of at least $200 per month to clear that. And any other sales tax liability in the state, whether reduced to judgment or not. And he had to comply with any further orders of the auction board.
And as it relates, what does it mean that, as it relates to dealing with people? What was the restrictions as you understood it?
He would not.
And what did that mean? I mean, could he execute a consignment control
No.
on behalf of the auction house?
According to this, he cannot execute any agreements, period. And that, a consignment control form is quite often used by auctioneers as an agreement. Sometimes that's the only agreement you ever see.
As a result of reviewing that, did you proceed to the next step, either with an investigation or formal action?
I proceeded in this case because I felt after this return that there was some information here that confirmed Ms. Fasola's contentions. As I got more into it, I did bring in an investigator to actually take a statement and to see if we could get more information regarding the transaction.
And that would have been Mr. Jim Steve.
That's correct.
And what, after reading the response by Mr. Buhler, both Mr. Buhlers, what were the issues that you were concerned about?
Mr. Matt Buhler admitted that there had been some clerical errors, that an item had been misassigned. He referred to 9,000 lot numbers or ghost consignor numbers. There was also an admission with regard to not paying timely because they had lost the item that had been consigned. And there was a contention that an item had been broken and had to be replaced.
As a result of your review of all this information, what actions did you next take?
I'm going to set this forward.
And in the actual hearing, you alleged a specific allegation of a violation, correct?
I actually alleged two.
And that was sections 4 and 5, 1, efforts to deceive or defraud the public, and 5, incompetency or gross negligence.
That's correct.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, between losing the name of the consignor, not paying appropriately, and breaking things, and some indication that this is an ongoing problem, because I've seen this before from both Buhlers, I determined that there was an incompetency issue. I also had an allegation from Ms. Fasula, which I had no reason not to believe that she felt that she had been deceived.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay. Mr. Rankin?
Ms. Town, have there ever been any other complaints against Estate Auction Services?
Not from a third party. The board did have and dealt with one at the beginning of 2012.
What was that?
There was a sale, and again, Mr. Buhler provides us, or at least she provided us with copies of transactions, because I would tell him I want to subpoena them, and might as well go ahead and give them to me, because the board charged me with monitoring his activities after the agreement. There was some indication in the sale that's called the Wrist Hotel sale that there was sloppiness failure to have contracts and some issues with regard to summer activities with regard, not keeping track of things very well. We were concerned, and I sat down with them at that time rather than going to formal complaint and said, please, get some contracts, keep track of things. I spent an hour with them going over what I would ask them to do.
I have some
Redirect.
questions.
Can
I'm
you
sorry.
redirect?
Did you have any other? The original infraction in 2006 with Ken, what was the basis of that?
And this, I'll try to make this as concise and short as I can. Basically, Mr. Buhler had an auction house here in Baton Rouge and had one for some time. He was dealing in some high-end auctions and high-end sales of antiques and other things. He, whatever reason, he pledged third-party consigned items to a bank as security for a loan. As the bank, he didn't pay the loan, the bank foreclosed on the loan, and a number of consigners' property was taken as part of that. There were complaints filed by a number of these consigners, and we handled those through a proceeding that was held in 2006.
You said that you found intentional misconduct. Was it just based upon the fact that the complainant told you that she felt it was intentional?
You're talking about
The current complaint?
Yes, that was, and we were still looking to see if there were any indications of anything other than just gross incompetence.
Did you actually find anything that was intentional other than incompetence? Because
No.
You didn't.
No,
But you did find incompetence, the fact that you didn't keep records.
That's correct.
Was ever contacted by anyone?
Particularly other than the,
Yes.
this facility, no.
Was that something he was not supposed to do?
That's- He cannot execute or,
He cannot.
no,
So
he's
that-
only
that-
all auctions.
So he actually disobeyed the previous agreement that he entered into with the board.
It is my belief that he has done so, yes.
And did you ask him about this? Did you talk to him about this in your investigation?
I sent the formal notice to him, and he responded with, I believe this is exhibit number 2, in which case, he refers to Roue, and I would have to assume that he was part of these transactions.
Because he said "we" in the document?
Yes.
Did you
Basically
actually?
said, if I could, we have
Yeah, go ahead.
staple in the wrong place. This is to verify that Judy facilitated on several cases and has put reserves and select items, and every time I told her that we only do that on high-end items, and that none of the items she consigned was qualified. Qualified, thank you. Yeah.
So he actually admitted that he actually participated in it.
Yeah, he said here also, I explained to her on many occasions that the more her items bring, the more we make. So he was obviously talking to her about the transaction.
And that's something that he said he was not supposed to do when the board reinstated his
That's
license.
correct. And I had discussed that with him on more than one of these occasions.
All right, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Is there anywhere in the restrictions that were placed on Mr. Buhler that he cannot communicate with a consignor?
I'll call your attention to that. Basically, as I understood, he couldn't execute any agreements, and he was only to call the auctions for those 2 particular auctions.
Have you seen any agreement that Mr. Buhler, Ken Buhler, has executed?
Off the hand, a written agreement, no.
But your interpretation of this restriction is that he cannot communicate with a consignor?
I believe that any time that there's a transaction leading up to the execution of contract, that, and I informed him of this, I believe that he should not be involved in that transaction.
So he shouldn't return a phone call from a consignor?
I'm not saying that, but he cannot discuss with them specifics of the transaction.
Isn't there a distinction between discussing with somebody a transaction and executing a document in connection with that transaction?
The execution is obviously one thing, and obligates the state auction services, and he cannot do that. The discussion with regard to what the transaction was going to be as part of the execution in my interpretation of the agreement.
So if he were to respond to a question that would be, is there going to be a minimum bid or can I place a reserve? And he said, no, we don't do that, that would be a violation?
That may not be, because that's part of the actual call.
Item number 2 in the agreement says, you will not execute any agreements with sellers or consigners, execute any agreements with consigners or buyers, nor shall you receive any money from buyers or pay any consigners. You will not handle any of the money for any auction for which you work. You will work under State Auction Services or Henderson Auctions and will call only auctions. Is there any restriction in this provision that he cannot communicate with consigners?
With regard to calling auctions, he may communicate with
No,
us.
no, is there a restriction, Anna, please? Is there any restriction in that document that he is forbidden to communicate, to talk, to explain, to answer questions from consigners?
You will only call auctions, period. That's the way I interpreted it. That's his only involvement, it should be his only involvement.
But you've acknowledged that he should probably return phone calls.
Then he can discuss, oh, that's nice, here, would you talk to my father, he's in charge of this particular.
Would you agree with me that a violation of this agreement is would be punitive? It could result in suspension, revocation, loss of his license.
That's why the agreement was done, was to make sure that he abided by the guidelines of this particular agreement.
Do you see anything in there that he did not abide by the letter of that agreement, and as that agreement is specifically written?
Obviously, you and I disagree on what's specifically written here.
How?
What does it mean when it says, we'll only call auctions? What is the call an auction? What does that mean?
And again, I refer the specific details of that to the people who are experts, which is the board. My interpretation is he shows up that day and it's basically a contract document, that he would call the auction, he handed the events of that day, acknowledging bids, taking care of descriptions, etc. That was never part of any allegation or complaint and so that's how I interpret it.
And that all the activities pre-auction day of getting documents signed, communicating, talking about reserves, that has nothing to do with actually calling an auction.
That's correct.
That's all the question I have. The first 2 pages are you, and the third page is from your son, correct? And then there were some additional documents. Let me ask you if you can clear up, if you can, this document that was marked as exhibit number 5. The document that has been provided by the complainant appears to be a item signed by her, but with no listing of items. Is that correct?
That is correct.
When the items were picked up, is that the normal process for y'all to pick up items without having them?
It occasionally happens, but it's not the normal process.
So when you actually picked it up, there was no specific listing?
There was, as you know, I need to sign the form to accept the board. And so the boards were not picking up, and I took that and didn't put it this way.
So you said your
I
employees.
sent a signed document.
So in the exhibit number 2, there is a listing of documents, which is 2 pages, and you recognize that?
That's what we put them on.
Okay.
We put them on the wrong piece.
And in reference to that, this was never signed by the complainant, is that correct? Now, who would be the individual that would have been communicating with the complainant? during this process?
Well,
Let me ask you, did you know Ms. Basula?
so yes, I visited with her twice. We communicated by phone and tried to get together because she told me of her unhappiness with her. And so we tried to get together. One time she had to cancel, another time I had to cancel, et cetera. And we finally did sit down and discuss things. And then she also told me then about the broken table. As I said in my statement, the boys claimed that it was not broken when they delivered it, but I took Mr. Sewell's word that it was broken, and we took it back and fixed it and had it delivered.
Now, in reference to this issue about the armoire that was listed in the 9,000 series, can you explain to the board what transpired and what happened?
Yeah. Since they're all auctioneers, I would assume that they occasionally have lot tags that are missing, or even an item, God forbid, does get in without having a lot number on it. Our practice, we use a program called AuctionPlex, and so all the items, we record them first, and then we go into the AuctionPlex. And when it's entered into AuctionPlex, if it's a 9,000 number, we don't, rather than stopping the auction at the moment and trying to find out to whom the item belongs, we go ahead and record it as a ghost consignment. I have set up in the system one consignment number, or one custom number, that is the one that we need to straighten out. And so it doesn't slow down the auction, we keep going. And as soon as the auction is over, I print out the information from the ghost consignor, and Ken and I go over it, and we straighten those things out. Now, the problem is, in this particular case, there was a clerical error, and it was assigned to Morris Voorhees as opposed to and so it was actually sold on the auction on the 16th.
And was Mr. Voorhees paid for that?
He was paid for it, yeah.
And when did you determine or find out that that was incorrect?
It actually was a week or two, honestly, because the sequence of events, Ken asked me if Mr. Silver's armoire had been sold. I looked at her records and saw that no armoire listed on her record was being sold, so I told her no. So I didn't know that it was an issue for maybe another week or so. And then we did our investigation, which took us another few days to find out that it was in fact sold and credited to the Voorhees estate.
Now, there was some testimony from Ms. Basula concerning her telling you not to sell any more of her items. Do you recall that?
I never had such a conversation with her that I can recall. If I do not recall ever having such a conversation with her.
I'm going to show you what I'm...
You know why Mrs. Basula did not sign the consignment contract that was only signed by you?
No, only thing I can imagine is that they made 2 trips out to get the items, and they got the wrong one signed. She signed the blank one instead of the one. That's the only explanation.
And does the document, and I'm referring to the consignment contract, does that place any reserve on any items that are listed there? Because I didn't see it if it did.
No.
And as a business owner, you do admit today to the board that you are guilty of sloppy record keeping. Do you admit that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Buhler, you're aware that the statute says that every auctioneer shall pay the consignor within 30 days from the receipt of the funds or within 60 days from the date of the sale of the auction, whichever is less.
Correct.
Okay, so that didn't happen in this particular case.
It did not happen in this case. To me, there's a logical explanation for that because we didn't know we owed her the money for several weeks. And we discovered that it had been, we were taken wrong place.
Yes, sir. Now, this is exhibit number 5 by the board, and this is exhibit number 2. And I just call your attention to those. You see those 2 documents?
Yeah.
It appears that the document number 5 of our exhibits does not have the language of see attached list written in on what she received at her home. Is that correct?
That does,
So sometime after the fact, someone wrote on this particular document, which, let's have, pull that
Is it
towards you just a
in here?
second. Okay. So it appears that sometime after she received this document here, at some other time, someone wrote see attached list. Is that correct?
it could be.
You don't know for sure.
I don't know.
Whose handwriting that is, do you know?
Not mine.
Any questions for you? Mr. Brantley, any other?
May or may not call Ken, I need another recess.
Okay,
My second bottle of water just went.
okay, we'll take another 5 minutes.
Recess.
Thomas, further testimony about this matter will be the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Mr. Buhler, could you give us your name and address?
Kenneth Buhler, 1701 LALB, number 48, Baton, Louisiana, 70806.
And you've been present for all of the testimony of individual witnesses.
Yes, sir.
So let me ask you to call your attention to exhibit number 4. Is that the agreement between the board and yourself?
Yes, sir.
And let's get to the issue of what do you see as what you understood or what you thought your restrictions were?
Well, among other things, it clearly says that I cannot execute contracts, and I cannot handle the money, which I do neither, have never done either since I've been licensed in this state.
And do you believe that any of your activities of being in contact with this particular complaint would be something outside the area in which would be calling auctions?
No, sir. Everything I do, when the board gave my license back, sir, they knew that my father, and he was kind enough, and I hate that he's here because in 60-some years of business, this is the first time his ethics have ever been challenged or questioned. So I apologize for that. But no, sir, I don't do anything with outside of the boundaries of my.
So to the extent that what you think is that you've been in compliance with your requirements under the agreement.
Sir, I have deep respect for the board and know how important my license is.
And so let's talk just briefly. How did you come into contact with the complaint?
Ms. Fasula called me, I don't remember the dates, but she called one day because my phone number is posted, because my father has no knowledge of antiques, so therefore people call me to discuss it. So she called me, and I did know her, my previous ex-wife, whom most of you had the pleasure of meeting, they were friends at one point in time, and Ms. Fasula was incorrect. She had actually been to my home at one point in time, years ago. And but anyway, she called me and she said she was in a bind. She really needed to sell some antiques, and she heard I was back and I helped her out. So I went to her house and met her.
But you signed no agreements with her?
No, sir.
And were you there and present when she signed this blank?
Yes, sir.
Consigned?
You explain the policy. Oftentimes when there's multiple items that an estate that we're picking up, we get them back, we get the consignor to sign the contract, saying, yes, I agree to these terms and conditions. I'm sold to the highest bidder. And then we get back to the building, we unload those items, roll them up, and then we list all those items and we do an attached list. So at that point in time, we would have gone back on there and I wrote C attached list. And my wife is the one, or my father, that actually enters the items in the inventory.
That's not something, a standard procedure that you give to someone before it leaves their home?
No.
Or their, wherever?
Well, she got a copy of the signed contract, but she didn't get it. She got the listing. We didn't pick up that day. Let me try to explain this. We did not pick up merchandise that day. So when my nephew and Reginald Sterling and my son Wyatt went back to pick up merchandise, they did at that time give her a copy of the merchandise.
She indicates, you heard her testimony today, that she never received that copy, which is listed with exhibit pages 1 and 2.
I will say this to you, that we received those copies from the Louisiana Auctioneer's licensing board as part of the complaint, so I'm quite confident she did receive this.
That those particular items were attached in her complaint? Is that your testimony?
No, it's not my testimony. My testimony is that we received those copies that showed items listed from Ms. Anna Dowd, from Louisiana Auctioneer's licensing board, as part of the complaint for us to respond to. So she did receive those copies.
I have a copy of the actual complaint, which is exhibit number 1, which has this, what I call the blank consignment form. Does not show any listing of it. And then exhibit number 2, which has been marked as identification and identified by Ms. Dow as what she received from your office. Is that not correct?
That is correct, but what I'm saying is also correct. You're giving around what I'm saying. What I'm saying is Ms. Dow sent us a bunch of paperwork to respond to. And in the paperwork that Ms. Dow sent us were copies of Ms. Fasula's items listed.
Let me show you, this is exhibit number 1. Is that not what was sent to you by Ms. Dow?
This is part of what was sent to us by Ms. Dow.
So what you're saying, there was more than that?
Absolutely. A lot more.
Would you agree with your father's assessment that there was some sloppy bookkeeping?
I don't consider, no, sir, I don't consider it sloppy bookkeeping. I mean, we've handled 24,000 items in the last 2 years, and every item is important to every customer. It's important to us as well. And we do our best to ensure that everybody gets paid in a timely fashion for their items. It is an unfortunate incident that does occur, and anybody that's ever been in the auction business will tell you it's going to happen. You know, the minute we recognized the problem, we addressed it, handled it, sent Ms. Fasula our money. We actually paid her before we even received our money back from Mr. Morris for the item that we paid for.
You will agree that that was not consistent with the statutory requirements?
No, sir, I will not agree, because statutory requirements say 60 days, and depends on when you start the 60 days.
It says 30 days or 60 days, the lesser of the two. Does it not? Or do you know?
I don't know for a fact.
All right. In reference to the would you agree that the, I apologize, I got a phone going off here. That the auction took place on September 16, 2012, and she did not receive payment for the armoire until November 7, 2000.
Yes, sir, I would agree with that.
That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Buhler, have you ever been advised that under paragraph 2 of the restrictions that you're under, don't handle money, don't sign contracts, call auctions, that you are not to have communications or to communicate with consignors?
No, sir, never. And quite frankly, I think that's unrealistic. I couldn't operate without communicating.
Now, again, apparently, the statutory provision for payment of funds to a consignor is within 30 days of the auction. The outside 60 or the lesser of the two, which would be obviously 30. And I would assume that that is under normal circumstances. In this situation, there was a mistake that was made. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Was that mistake corrected?
Yes, sir, it was correct.
As soon as it was corrected, did you remit money to Ms. Fasula?
Yes, sir, we did.
Did you remit that money before you, in fact, had received return of your funds?
Yes, sir, we did.
Don't have anything else.
I have some questions.
Can you redirect?
I do.
Just in the sense that your contractual agreement has a lesser time frame than reference, correct?
Yes, sir. Well, we try to adhere to that.
10 days from the day of the sale.
Ms. Jacobs?
I have some questions, because I understand you and your family knew Mrs. Fasula before the auction.
Yes,
She
sir.
actually knew your wife, is it, and also you?
My ex-wife.
Your ex-wife.
Yes, ma'am.
And she contacted you didn't make a contact with her, she contacted you because she knew you were back, she knew you were a good auctioneer, and she had some stuff that wanted to be auctioned.
Yes, ma'am.
You never initiated the contact.
No, ma'am.
When she called you, having known her in the past, you accepted the telephone call and you all talked.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, this agreement that you have with the board was following what I consider to be a very egregious complaint for which you pled guilty or were found guilty. You agree with that, right?
Yes,
And when that agreement was agreed to by you and or your attorney, was it explained to you that you were not supposed to have any contact with anybody, only pry auctions. And to me, when I pry an auction, that means getting up on the floor and actually calling an auction. That's how I interpret prying an auction. Was that ever explained to you?
No, ma'am, not in my, no, ma'am.
Right. And do you regularly talk to clients?
Yes, ma'am.
You do when they call about, you know, what they need to do, et cetera?
Yes, ma'am, I've been selling antiques for over 30 years, and I'm pretty familiar with
And you have
antiques.
a specific knowledge on antiques.
I've
so-
been declared an expert in numerous courts throughout the
I see.
state. I've done appraisals for insurance companies all across the state.
The people ask your opinions on certain things.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, Mrs. Fasulo sought you out because of your expertise.
Yes, ma'am.
That's all the question.
The things, items that you picked up, the 3 items on the consignment sheet that wound up in the 9,000 series.
Yes, sir.
I've been an auctioneer for 38 years. Okay?
Yes, sir.
I can understand maybe 1 item per consignment, but 3?
Yes, sir. Bear in mind, sir, and I'm asking you to keep this in your mind, that when she called us, she was rushing us because she needed money now. We had this big estate sale that was already set up, over 1,000 items in it. And we were trying to hurry up and get her merchandise in this good sale to help her. You know, like I explained to Ms. Fasula a million times, we work on a commission basis. The more it brings, the more we make. You know, we like to.
I would like to say a couple things, and I'll be just brief. What Estate Auction Services has been charged with requires a couple of findings by the board. One, that the efforts were to deceive or defraud, which I think we clearly disproved, and incompetency and gross negligence. Gross negligence, I think, is out. Incompetency, there were some mistakes made. There's clearly mistakes made, there's no question. Now, does that border on incompetency? I don't believe so. I honestly don't believe so. Now, the bigger issue to me is the interpretation of paragraph 2 of that agreement that we have, the restrictions that we have with the board. I cannot honestly fathom, and it clearly is not stated in there, that he cannot have communication with the customer or consignors. And I think, as the board is aware, being auctioneers, that would be an impossible burden for someone to have. And going over and above that, the law requires that if an administrative agency is to interpret a regulation or a restriction in a particular manner, they have to give the person that is complying with that regulation clear knowledge that any action they take will be in violation of that interpretation. And it's clearly an interpretation, because that document, which has to be strictly construed, doesn't say that he can't communicate. And I can't in my wildest imagination believe that was the intent of this board, that he could not talk to or explain or respond to telephone calls or other attempted communications. Again, you know, I could write a memorandum on it, I have for other agencies, that if you want somebody to comply with an interpretation, you got to tell them what that interpretation is. It's got to be abundantly clear, and it certainly wasn't clear here. And I don't think the board should even consider placing that type of interpretation on that restriction, because think about it from your own standpoint. How do you not communicate with a consignor or with a customer? That's all I have.
Mr. Bankston, you're entitled to have the final word if you would like it.
I will be very extremely brief. I think there's no question that there was a violation because of the issue of not keeping straight of everything. What's the appropriate penalty? I think there is a penalty that needs to be imposed, but that's certainly the discretion of this board. But I think if the board desires to have the agreement modified with Mr. Buhler, then that issue needs to be determined going forward if the board wants to make that communication, that aspect clarified. But I think there's no question there was a violation. I don't think it was an intentional violation. I don't think there was an intentional fraud. but there was some violations, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you. All right, is there a motion?
I'd like to make a motion that we go into executive session.
Second.
Is there any discussion or opposition? All right, on the record? Yes. All right, is there a motion to come out of executive session?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. All right, we're back on the record. All the board members are here. The board's counsel and the respondent's counsel are both here.
Yes, sir.
I would like the record to reflect that before we went into executive session, there was no request made by the respondent or his attorney to have these deliberations made open. Is there any discussion from the board, or would anyone like to make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion.
Okay.
Make a motion, we fine estate auctions on 2 counts for $500 each, bookkeeping and late payment.
Okay, so it'll be a total of $1,000. Is there a second on that motion? And second, is there any discussion?
I will not go along with the particular motion. I do agree that estate auction services should be fined $1,000, but I also agree that Ken Buhler should be fined $500 because I think he actually participated in the auction more than he was supposed to according to the previous agreement that he entered into with the board in 2010. And I think that because of that, there should be restrictions on him, and this should serve, a $500 fine would serve as a deterrent from him doing that until such time as this board and he clarified what he can do and what he can't do. And I'm also going to ask this tribunal to ask Ms. Dow to place on the agenda for the next board meeting the fact that we will discuss what he can do and can't do, part of the restrictions.
Okay. I don't know, normally when you give her legal work, do you require a motion for that, or does she have a standard contract where she can just do what you want? Because I don't know if that needs to be made in the form of
She
a
has
motion.
a contract.
She has a contract, I believe.
Okay.
I would put that in the form of a motion after this vote. I'll look for that, I'll seek for that. And sometimes, I guess as board members, we agree to disagree. I think that the gray area efforts that we had in the ruling on Mr. Buhler left it with some opportunity. We need to do a better job as a board that we make sure we're very clear in what we're sanctioning on in that ruling. So at that time, that's why I felt that finding the company on the bookkeeping and the late payment was something I felt we definitely needed to do, and finding him on the other ruling itself, I didn't feel like this time until we get that straightened out. I hope very genuinely that we never have this kind of problems again with Mr. Buhler. I hope he understands the seriousness of this offense and what we're doing, and I hope the company, I've seen them already make strides forward in their bookkeeping efforts and their late payment efforts. But we want to see these guys really not before this board at any point in time again.
Is there any other discussion on the motion?
Well, actually, Mr. Buhler was before the board for failure to pay his sales tax previously, so he already had violated the agreement in some respect. And for that reason, a $500 fine would serve as a deterrent, I think, in putting him on the right path towards conforming what we need him to do as a licensed Louisiana auctioneer.
All right, any other discussion? All right, I have a motion and a second. Let's take a vote. Do y'all want to do a roll call?
Roll call vote.
All right, Mr. Sims,
Yes.
Mr. McMillan,
Yes.
Ms. Jacobs,
Yes, for the reasons that I have stated. In other words, I'm for a $500 fine for Ken Buhler.
That's not the motion.
and-
but the motion is for,
That's
so
not the
you're
motion.
voting no, the motion is $4,000 against the company and nothing against Mr. Buhler?
No, I'm against that.
So you're voting no.
Yeah.
Mr. Brewster?
Yes.
Mr. Bordelon?
Yes.
All right, motion carries 4-1.
I'd like to make a motion that we get Anna Dow, our attorney, to look at the agreement or the ruling with Mr. Buhler, and we go over that so we clarify to make sure we have no gray areas on that agreement.
I second that.
Okay, she'll have something to present to you at your May meeting for your approval to clarify the terms of the agreement, so it's very clear going forward what you can and can't do. We have motion and second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. All right, I will personally contact Ms. Dow and let her know about that, and she can contact one of y'all with questions. Is there any other business in this matter? All right, hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.